So I want to show you something. This might not be the most intuitive process, but it's a one way to kind of match up the species you might find at a place with the habitats that have been described in the document about floristic communities in Wisconsin. So I entered the species that have been mentioned in the document about floristic communities, and across the top here are a variety of habitats where they were mentioned. And so if a species was mentioned, here's one, a spruce, fir, the balsam fir, was mentioned for alder thicket, Algiphic slope. Just kind of whether they mentioned or not really indicating whether they were major components or specific to a certain kind of habitat. It's something I think I could probably work on this and make it a little more refined, maybe get some kind of confidence score. But for now, I think it helps you to match up. Just rather quickly kind of get you a few of these possible habitat types that you might be in. So I'll show you a couple examples using data that we've got so far, and maybe helping to match these up. So every species found in Wisconsin should be here. This would be native species would be mentioned. Sometimes the non-native species are mentioned, but it's really not exceptional to say that an invasive species is found in a habitat, right? So we know they're invasive. We know they're good at getting into habitats where they're not native. So it's not really a point of confidence if we say that we have a certain non-native species there. All right, so we can kind of go across. There's just an X in each habitat where certain species would be found. And we want to narrow this down to species that we have found. So I have here a spreadsheet that has a data tab and then a tab that I just called list to check. So you could, I'll make this available to you. I don't know if you could make it work for you. Let's find out. You can take a list of species and paste it in here. And these two sheets on the spreadsheet, they check against each other. So this list of species checks against the data sheet, and if anything has been mentioned as belonging to one or more habitats, then it'll show up in this column here. So I just call this whether it's on the page. Some of these are not mentioned. So Baptisia alba, not mentioned there. Carex brevior, for example. But a lot of these are mentioned. And so it refers to the other page, and then it refers back to the species I found there. I can sort this column, and it sorts by the ones that have been found. So what I've got here now is a collection of species, and they'll get an X for each of these habitats that they're found in. So we can kind of see in this zone that we've created of species that we found, some of these columns are going to show up as having lots of X's. So Mesic prairie now has 6 X's, 6 species in our set that are mentioned as being found in the Mesic prairie. Here's another one, oak barrens, not as many, there are 5 species there. You can just kind of visualize these as you go down. 4 species there, 5 species here in the wet prairie, wet Mesic prairie. So definitely I think we're getting a lot of confidence that we're in a prairie if we have these species. And then the type of prairie would come down to specific species being present or not. This is the data that I used for the example research project using the Whitewater Nature Preserve, and there are kind of a collection of plants I found upland and also lowland. Let me skip over to the spring green habitat. I have a really big species list for that. So we have probably the largest number of species as I've included in any inventory so far. We can copy these from the floristic calculator that I also made available to you. And we'll see if this works. And list to check. We're going to replace that whole list here, just paste it down. And that's turning out pretty well. I need to populate these down a little bit. So I'm going to, some of what I'm doing is actually, I find it easier on the Google Sheets version. So you could import your your Excel document into Google Sheets. There are ways to do all of these in Microsoft Excel. like I said, you might be able to make this work for you, you might not. Okay, so basically imported the data over from the other sheet. If the species was not found, then it doesn't get brought over. Sometimes there's a little name, a slight difference in the name that's used for a species, an older or newer name. Something to fix on the back end, I guess. All right, so all told we have, let's see here. Tell me please, it's not going to tell me. There we go. Okay, so on Google Sheets down here in the corner, they'll tell you count. So 38 of our species are referenced in the document about habitat types. And so we can scroll over, and I've got just a rather simple calculator here that goes through down and calculates the number of X's that are found. So none of these species is characteristic of an alder thicket or an American lotus lily marsh. No surprises there. Bedrock glade, 4 of our, what did I say, 32, 34 species, 4 species, 5 species, 6 species. So we have a running leader as eastern red cedar thicket. It doesn't sound very promising. All right, I was getting worried there. All right, now we have 12 species, 14 species, 10 species. So oak barrens, sand prairie here at 14, pine barrens at 10. So I think this is a good illustration of the habitat types that cross over. So there would be a difference in these habitats. There's lots that's not contained in this list. Differences in, you could describe the hydrology or the substrate, the soil type, light levels, and maybe determine differences in these. Pine barrens might have a certain coverage of pine, which just really we didn't record any pine. These are like pine associated species that we got. So probably the simplest way at our stage is just to grab the column with the largest number. So sand prairie, 14 of those, largest number of species represented, and not surprising, it was a prairie and it had a sandy substrate, so this particular habitat type called the sand prairie would be the possibly the most likely at this point.